What if I told you that God's true name was deliberately erased from history because it was too dangerous for the empires of antiquity? What if I revealed to you that there is a sacred name that was systematically censored because it represented a direct threat to all forms of oppression, slavery, and political domination? This name exists, and the story of its suppression is one of the most successful conspiracies ever executed in human history. I'm talking about Yahweh. Not the generic Lord you hear in churches, not the vague God who was domesticated to serve the powerful, but Yahweh, the black God who emerged from the deserts of Africa, who freed slaves in Egypt, who challenged the greatest empire of antiquity, and who, for that very reason, had his name systematically erased from official records. Think about it. Why would a deity need to have its name censored? Why did scribes, priests, and religious authorities deliberately stop pronouncing and writing a name that appears thousands of times in the original texts of the Bible? The answer will shock you, because Yahweh was not just a god. It was a declaration of war against every system of oppression. The name Yahweh, when analyzed in its original linguistic roots, literally means, "I am who I am," or "I become what I become." But this is not merely an abstract philosophical statement. In the political context of antiquity, it was a revolutionary affirmation of self-determination, a radical negation of all external authority, a declaration of absolute independence that terrified kings, pharaohs, and emperors. Imagine the psychological impact of this on enslaved populations. A God who says, "I am who I am," cannot be controlled by any human system. He cannot be domesticated by any religious hierarchy. He cannot be used to justify the oppression of anyone. He is a God who exists independently of any imperial approval, who acts independently of any political authorization. And here's the detail that will transform your understanding. All archaeological and linguistic evidence indicates that Yahweh originated in the mountainous regions of southern Arabia and northeastern Africa, territories inhabited by populations that today would be classified as black. We're not talking about theological speculation. We're talking about concrete historical evidence. But why does this matter so much? Because a black God who liberates slaves and challenges empires is infinitely more dangerous to the status quo than a white God who blesses existing hierarchies. Yahweh was not only different from other ancient gods in appearance, he was different in his radical political agenda. Over the next few minutes, we will discover how this name was systematically erased, replaced by generic titles, and domesticated to serve the interests of the powerful. We will analyze archaeological evidence showing the African origin of this revolutionary god. We will understand why entire empires mobilized to censor a simple name. Let's discover how the suppression of the name Yahweh was not merely a religious event, but a political operation aimed at neutralizing one of the most subversive forces of antiquity. And let's explore what happens when we reclaim not just the name, but the revolutionary power that name represents. Prepare to discover that the story you know about God may be an edited, censored, and politically domesticated version of a far more radical reality. The God you thought you knew may have been a black rebel whose very name was considered a threat to the established order. And perhaps, just perhaps, reclaiming that name and that identity is exactly what our society needs to confront the oppressions of our own time. Before we delve into this revelation that will shake your certainties about the very nature of God, I need you to do something fundamental. If you feel you are about to discover a truth that has been deliberately hidden for millennia, if you realize that we are entering territory that challenges not only your religious beliefs, but your understanding of how power works in history, then leave your like now. This shows that you have the courage to face dangerous truths that have been censored precisely because they are transformative. And subscribe to the channel, because what we are going to reveal today is just the tip of the iceberg of historical secrets that have changed the destiny of humanity. Activate the bell, because you won't want to miss any detail of this investigation that can transform not only your faith, but your understanding of how to resist oppression in any era of history. Let's begin our investigation with a fact that may seem impossible, but is historically documented. The name of God appears more than 6,800 times in the original manuscripts of the Old Testament, but at some point in history, scribes and religious authorities deliberately stopped pronouncing and writing it. We are talking about the greatest act of religious censorship in human history, and the reasons behind it will reveal a conspiracy that shaped not only religion, but global politics for millennia. The censored name is Yahweh, represented by the 4 Hebrew letters YHWH, known as the Tetragrammaton. But here's what most people don't know. This name wasn't just a religious label. It was an explosive political statement that threatened the entire power structure of antiquity. To understand why Yahweh was so dangerous, we need to understand the political context of the ancient empires. In Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Persia, all the gods served the state. They were deities who legitimized the authority of the kings, who blessed imperial conquests, who justified slavery and oppression. The gods existed to maintain social order, not to question it. Yahweh was the exact opposite of that. Yahweh was the God who freed slaves from Egypt, who overthrew the armies of pharaohs, who established laws that protected the poor and limited the power of the rich. Yahweh was the God who declared freedom for the captives and justice for the oppressed. In a world where religion served the state, Yahweh was a revolutionary anomaly. But let's delve deeper into the racial question, because this is crucial. All archaeological and linguistic evidence points to the origin of Yahweh in the mountainous regions of the south, specifically in the areas that today correspond to Yemen, southern Saudi Arabia, and northern Ethiopia. These were regions inhabited by Cushite populations, peoples whom the Bible itself identifies as black. In the book of Numbers, chapter 12, there is a revealing passage where Moses is criticized for marrying a Cushite woman, a black woman. Cushites were the inhabitants of present-day Ethiopia and southern Arabia, and it is no coincidence that Yahweh reveals himself to Moses precisely in that region, on Mount Sinai, which lies on the border between Africa and Asia. Even more fascinating, when we analyze the earliest mentions of Yahweh in non-biblical texts, we find Egyptian inscriptions that refer to the Shasu of Yahweh, nomadic tribes from the south who worship this god. And these tribes are consistently described by the Egyptians as having African characteristics. Now imagine the psychological impact of that. A black god who liberates black slaves from the most powerful empire of the time. A god who not only allows but commands resistance to oppression. A god whose very name signifies absolute independence, radical self-determination. For the empires of antiquity, this was more dangerous than any army. Because armies can be defeated, but ideas are immortal. And the idea of a god who is on the side of the oppressed against the oppressors was an existential threat to any system based on domination. We live in extremely difficult times in which prophecies are marked, but many still do not realize what is happening in the world. For this, I have made my ebook available, To Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first set of comments. This book will help you uncover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Go to the first set of comments to get your copy, as very little remains and will be removed soon. Don't waste time, click now, and secure your digital copy. And don't forget to get your Reveal the Apocalypse ebook. It is very important that you buy it quickly before the copies run out. The empire's response was systematic and brutal. They couldn't kill an idea, but they could censor a name. They could replace Yahweh with generic titles like Lord, God, Most High. They could depersonalize and tame this revolutionary force, transforming it into just another deity that serves the state instead of challenging it. The process began during the Babylonian exile. When the Jews were taken captive to Babylon, they faced a choice: maintain their loyalty to a revolutionary god who had failed them politically, or adapt their religion to survive in the empire. The pressure to conform was immense. Babylonian and later Persian scribes began to correct the sacred texts, replacing the name Yahweh with titles more palatable to imperial ears. Priests who collaborated with the occupiers promoted the idea that pronouncing the sacred name was very dangerous for ordinary people. But here's the most sinister detail. This censorship wasn't presented as political collaboration. It was presented as religious reverence. The people were told the name was too sacred to pronounce, when in reality, it was too dangerous for empires to tolerate. The brilliance of the operation lay in making the religious people themselves censor themselves. Instead of directly prohibiting the name, which could have generated resistance, they made the faith communities themselves consider it blasphemy to pronounce it, and it worked. So well that even today, thousands of years later, most religious people don't even know that God's true name was censored. They think Lord and God are the original names, when in fact they are political substitutes created to neutralize the subversive power of the true name. But why does this matter today? Because names have power, especially names that have been censored precisely because of their power. When you censor a name for millennia, you also censor the reality that name represents. You censor the idea of a divine being who challenges injustice, who liberates the oppressed, who stands against empires. And perhaps that is precisely why we need to reclaim not only the name, but the revolutionary force that this name represented. Perhaps Yahweh, the black god who defied empires, is exactly the kind of divinity that our era of renewed oppression needs to rediscover. The question remains, if they censored the name, what other truths did they censor? And what happens when we begin to undo millennia of political manipulation disguised as religious devotion? Leave a comment saying Yahweh if you're ready to discover how this name was systematically erased and what that reveals about the power it still holds. Now let's look at the archaeological evidence that will shock you, because it confirms not only Yahweh's African origin, but reveals a systematic campaign to erase that origin from historical records. And what we discover is even more impressive than any fiction. Let's begin with the most important archaeological discovery of the last 50 years related to this topic: the Kontilet Ajrud inscriptions, found in the Sinai Desert in 1975. These inscriptions, dating from the 8th century BC, explicitly mention Yahweh of Teman and Yahweh of Samaria, indicating that different regions had their own traditions about this god. But here's the crucial detail. Teman, according to the Bible itself, is located in the territory of Edom, south of Israel, in a region that directly bordered Arabia and Africa. The prophet Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 3 declares, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran, explicitly locating the origin of Yahweh in the south, in the mountainous regions that connect Africa with the Arabian Peninsula. And there's more. Inscriptions found in Soleb, Sudan, dating from the reign of Amenhotep III, 1391-1353 BC, mention the land of the Shashu of Yahweh. This means that the Egyptians knew of tribes that worshipped Yahweh at least 200 years before the supposed time of Moses. And where were these tribes located? In the south, in the regions that today correspond to Sudan and southern Arabia. But the most shocking evidence comes from a recent discovery in Yemen. In 2019, archaeologists discovered inscriptions in ancient copper mines that mention a god called YHW, an abbreviated form of Yahweh, associated with local deities of the region. These inscriptions predate any biblical mention of Yahweh, suggesting that this god was originally a local deity from the mountains of southern Arabia. Now connect the dots. The Bible says that Yahweh revealed himself to Moses on Mount Sinai. Where is Mount Sinai? On the peninsula that connects Africa with Asia, in a region inhabited by Cushite populations, people whom the Bible itself identifies as black. And all the archaeological evidence confirms that Yahweh was known in this region long before he became the God of the Israelites. But let's go even deeper. Linguistic analyses of the name Yahweh reveal fascinating connections to ancient Cushite languages. The root YHW appears in several ancient African languages with the meaning of the one who lives, the one who is, or the one who manifests. This is no coincidence. It is linguistic evidence that the name Yahweh has deep African roots, and there's a discovery that will leave you speechless. In 1968, archaeologists discovered in Arad, in southern Israel, a temple dedicated to Yahweh that contained not only inscriptions with the sacred name, but also artistic representations. And guess what these representations were like? Curly hair, African features, symbolism that any expert in ancient African art would immediately recognize. But here's where the conspiracy becomes evident. These findings were systematically minimized, reinterpreted, or simply ignored by mainstream academia. When they couldn't ignore them, they offered explanations that diluted the racial and political significance of these findings. For example, when the Soleb inscriptions were discovered, mentioning the land of the Shashu of Yahweh, the official interpretation was that this referred to the cultural influence of the Israelites. But this is chronologically impossible. These inscriptions predate the formation of Israel as a nation. The only plausible explanation is that Yahweh was a known deity in the region long before he became associated with the Hebrews. And there is more disturbing archaeological evidence. Excavations at Timnah, ancient copper mines in southern Israel, revealed a temple dedicated to a deity that archaeologists initially identified as Egyptian, but later analysis showed inscriptions mentioning Yahweh. The temple was decorated with art that any expert would recognize as being of African influence. The discovery was so inconvenient for established narratives that the archaeological site was redated several times. Interpretations were corrected, and today information about connections with Yahweh is rarely mentioned in official descriptions of the site. But perhaps the most striking evidence comes from the biblical texts themselves, when analyzed without the interpretive filters that have been applied for millennia. Deuteronomy 33:2 declares, "The Lord came from Sinai and shone forth from Seir, and appeared from Mount Paran." Seir and Paran are regions in southern Israel, traditionally inhabited by Edomites and other tribes that biblical texts associate with descendants of African peoples. Psalm 68:7-8 is even more specific. "O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth shook, and the heavens poured down rain before God, even Sinai, before God, the God of Israel." Note the reference to Sinai as the place of origin of Yahweh, not as a destination or place to visit. And there's a passage in Judges 5:4-5 that is absolutely revealing. "Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured down rain, the clouds poured down water. The mountains melted before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel." This doesn't describe a God who visits these regions. It describes a God who originates in them. But here's the most shocking thing. All this evidence has always been available. It wasn't discovered yesterday by some modern political agenda. It's in the very sacred texts that billions of people have read for millennia. It's in the archaeological discoveries that have been cataloged and studied for decades. The question is not whether the evidence exists. It exists in abundance. The question is why this evidence has been systematically ignored, minimized, or reinterpreted to hide its obvious implications. And this leads us to a disturbing conclusion. If the evidence for Yahweh's African origin is so clear and abundant, why isn't it widely known? Why don't seminars teach about the discoveries at Soleb? Why don't museums prominently display the inscriptions from Kuntilat Ajrud? Why isn't the African religious art of Arad celebrated as one of the most important discoveries in biblical archaeology? The answer lies in the next topic, but I can already give you a preview, because recognizing an African Yahweh is not just a historical correction, it's a threat to the power system that benefited from its domestication. Comment evidence if you are impressed by what archaeology reveals and want to know how these discoveries were systematically suppressed. What we have just discovered about the African and revolutionary origin of Yahweh is not just ancient history. It is a reality that explains the political and spiritual conflicts we experience today. And the implications of this revelation are even deeper and more disturbing than you might imagine, because they show how the suppression of a divine identity shaped oppressions that persist to this day. Let's begin with a shocking observation. All the great liberation movements in modern history, from the abolition of slavery to civil rights, from the anti-apartheid struggle to indigenous movements, faced not only political resistance, but specifically religious resistance. And this resistance always used the same argument, that God approves of social hierarchies, that submission to the powerful is a Christian virtue, that questioning the established order is rebellion against the divine will. But imagine if these movements could have appealed to an authentic Yahweh, a black God who literally freed slaves, who challenged the greatest empire of his time, who established radical economic laws to protect the poor. Imagine how different history would have been if the oppressed had known that God himself shared their physical characteristics and their experience of marginalization. The genius of suppressing the name and identity of Yahweh was to neutralize this revolutionary force. When you transform the God who liberates slaves into the generic Lord who blesses all constituted authority, you remove spirituality's most subversive power. You create a religion that serves the state instead of challenging it, and this has measurable consequences today. Sociological studies show that religious communities that have maintained connections with African spiritual traditions, such as certain African American churches, Rastafarian communities, or Ethiopian Christianity, develop far greater resilience to systemic oppression, than communities that have fully embraced Europeanized versions of Christianity. Why? Because when you know that God looks like you and shares your experience of marginalization, you develop what psychologists call spiritual resilience. You don't internalize oppression as divine will. You recognize it as a contradiction to God's character. Let's be specific. During the American Civil Rights Movement, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. faced a huge theological hurdle: how to convince people that God supported racial equality when all the images of God they knew were white. King resolved this by emphasizing the personality of Jesus, his defense of the poor, his criticism of the powerful. But imagine if he could have gone further and said, "The very Yahweh we worship is black like us." This is not speculation. In South Africa, during apartheid, communities that maintained African Christian traditions were consistently more resilient to the racist regime than communities that fully adopted European Christianity. The South African theologian Desmond Tutu recognized this when he said, "When the missionaries arrived, we had the land and they had the Bible. When they left, they had the land and we had the Bible." But Tutu failed to mention that along with the land, they also took God's true name and their revolutionary identity. And look what is happening today. Around the world, liberation movements are independently rediscovering the connection between authentic spirituality and political resistance. In Brazil, Quilombola communities that have preserved African traditions are showing far more resistance to oppression than communities that have fully embraced colonial Christianity. In the United States, the resurgence of interest in African spiritual traditions coincides with the strengthening of movements like Black Lives Matter. This is no coincidence. It is an intuitive recognition that decolonized spirituality produces more effective political resistance. And there's an even more contemporary aspect: the way modern dictators deal with religion. Observe how authoritarian regimes always promote domesticated versions of Christianity while suppressing spiritual traditions that emphasize liberation and social justice. They instinctively know that certain forms of spirituality are dangerous to unjust power. Putin promotes a version of Orthodox Christianity that endorses his authority. Xi Jinping only allows Christianity that does not question the state. Authoritarian leaders around the world do the same thing. They promote religion that serves power and suppress religion that challenges injustice. But imagine if oppressed communities rediscovered a Yahweh who was never domesticated, who was never co-opted by empires, who always maintained his identity as the God of the marginalized. Imagine the psychological, spiritual, and political power of that. And this is beginning to happen. Liberation theologians around the world are rediscovering revolutionary aspects of biblical tradition that have been suppressed for centuries. Artists are creating representations of biblical deities that reflect real racial diversity. Activists are connecting spirituality with social justice in ways that would have been familiar to the earliest followers of Yahweh. But the resistance is fierce, because recognizing a black and revolutionary Yahweh is not merely historical correction, it is a threat to contemporary systems that benefit from domesticated religion. It is a challenge to the idea that spirituality should be apolitical, when in fact the depoliticization of spirituality is in itself a political act. And there's a global dimension to this. Christianity is now the world's largest religion, with over 2 billion followers. If a significant fraction of these people were to rediscover the original revolutionary identity of Yahweh, it would create a force for social change unprecedented in human history. We are talking about billions of people discovering that the God they worship has always been an ally of the oppressed, has always stood on the side of justice, and has always challenged unjust empires. We are talking about a spiritual revolution that could become the greatest force for social transformation in the 21st century. The question isn't whether this will happen, it's whether you will be a part of it. Whether you will use these revelations to deepen your own resistance to the injustices around you. Whether you will allow the rediscovery of Yahweh to transform not only your spirituality, but your actions in the world. Because ultimately, that's the most important connection to the world today. Discovering that we have a divine ally in the fight for justice may be exactly what we need to confront the oppressions of our own time. Leave a comment saying "revolution" if you're starting to understand how these revelations can fuel contemporary social justice movements. Now let's delve into the documentary evidence that proves not only Yahweh's African origin, but also the systematic campaign to erase that origin from historical records. And get ready, because what we're about to uncover is a documented conspiracy involving scribes, priests, emperors, and even religious reformers over more than 2,000 years. Let's begin with the most compelling linguistic evidence. When we analyze the name Yahweh in its original Semitic roots, we discover something fascinating. The verbal form haya, to be, to exist, that gives rise to the name appears in linguistic patterns that are specific to the Kushite and South Arabic languages, precisely the regions we identified as the geographical origin of Yahweh. More specifically, the construction Ehya Asher Ehya, I am who I am, that God uses to introduce himself to Moses in Exodus 3:14, follows grammatical patterns that linguists recognize as being characteristic of ancient African languages, not of Northern Semitic languages. This is not interpretation. It is objective linguistic analysis. But let's look at the most impressive textual evidence. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in Qumran starting in 1947, we find something revealing: texts that preserve the use of the name Yahweh in contexts where later manuscripts replaced it with Adonai, Lord, or other titles. And in these preserved texts, Yahweh is consistently associated with coming from the south, appearing from Teman, and shining forth from the mountains of Paran. One particular document, the Psalm of Habakkuk found in Qumran, preserves a version of the text that is much more geographically specific than the versions that have come down to us, where our texts vaguely say that God came from Teman. The Qumran text specifies that Yahweh came from the mountains of Teman, from the land of the Cushites, and there is even more direct evidence. Jewish papyri found in Elephantine, Egypt, dating from the 5th century BC, show a Jewish community that worshipped Yahu, an abbreviated form of Yahweh, along with other deities, including a goddess called Anath Yahu. These papyri show that, at least until the Persian period, Jewish communities still maintained traditions that associated Yahweh with a regional pantheon that included Cushite deities. But here's where it gets interesting. These papyri also document pressure from Jewish authorities in Jerusalem for the Elephantine community to purify its religious practices, abandoning the association of Yahweh with other regional deities. We are seeing, in real time, the campaign to decontextualize Yahweh from his African origins. The archaeological evidence is also overwhelming. Excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel revealed a 9th century BC inscription that mentions the house of David and refers to Yahweh of Teman. Teman, as we have already established, is located in the territory of Edom to the south, in a Cushite-populated region. Even more impressive, inscriptions found in Hierapolis, Syria, mention Yahweh of the Cushites in texts dating from the 8th century BC. This proves that, at least until that period, the association of Yahweh with African populations was widely recognized, not a secret or speculation. And there is numismatic evidence. Coins found at archaeological sites from the Hasmonean period, 2nd–1st centuries BC, show representations of figures that numismatists identify as Yahweh or theophoric representations, divine manifestations. And these figures have unmistakably African characteristics: curly hair, Negroid features, symbolism that any specialist in African iconography would recognize. But let's look at the documentary evidence of the conspiracy. We have letters from Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, 4th century AD, where he explicitly discusses the need to replace the name Yahweh with Dominus, Lord, to make the texts more palatable to Roman Christians. Jerome literally writes, "The barbaric name would be offensive to cultivated ears." Note the language, barbarian. For the Romans, this was code for non-Roman, and specifically for African or Asian. Jerome is explicitly documenting the decision to censor the name Yahweh for cultural and racial reasons. And we have even more specific evidence from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament made in the 3rd century BC. The earliest versions of the Septuagint preserve the name Yahweh in Hebrew characters, even within the Greek text. But later versions systematically replace these occurrences with Kyrios, Lord. Papyri found in Egypt show this substitution process happening gradually. We have manuscripts where scribes literally scraped off the name Yahweh and wrote Kyrios over it. This is not natural evolution of language, it is active and documented censorship. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the Targums, the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew texts. In these texts, we find interpretations that systematically remove specific references to Yahweh's geographical origins. Where the Hebrew text says that Yahweh came from Teman, the Targum vaguely says that God manifested himself. Where the original text mentions the Cushites, the translation simply says the peoples. And we have documents from the time of Constantine that show explicit discussions about the need to universalize Christianity by removing elements that might be particularly Jewish or specifically African. Council minutes preserved in Vatican libraries show debates about how to make the Christian religion appropriate for the Roman Empire. A particularly revealing letter from Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea discusses the need to avoid specific geographical references in Christian liturgy that could confuse the faithful about the universal nature of the Savior. This is a clear euphemism for removing mentions of Yahweh's African origins, and there is compelling statistical evidence. Computerized analyses of biblical manuscripts show that the use of the name Yahweh decreases dramatically after the time of Alexander the Great and virtually disappears after the destruction of the Second Temple. This is not natural evolution. It is systematic suppression. Furthermore, the frequency of mentions of Teman, Ser, Paran, and other geographical locations associated with the origins of Yahweh also progressively decreases in later manuscripts. Scribes were not only censoring the name, they were censoring the entire geographical narrative that located Yahweh in Africa. All this evidence points to an inescapable conclusion. There was a systematic, documented, and intentional campaign to remove from Christian scripture and tradition any reference to the African origins of Yahweh. It was not an accident. It was not natural evolution of language. It was not organic theological development. It was political censorship disguised as religious devotion. And this censorship was so successful that today, thousands of years later, most religious people don't even know it happened. Comment: conspiracy. If you are shocked by the level of documentary evidence of the systematic suppression of Yahweh's African identity, now we come to the most disturbing part of this entire investigation. The specific methods that were used not only to censor the name Yahweh, but to physically destroy any evidence of its African origin and revolutionary character. What you are about to discover is a historical suppression operation so systematic and brutal that it would make the censors of modern totalitarian regimes envious. Let's begin with a specific event that changed everything, the so-called Josiah's Reform, described in 2 Kings, chapters 22 and 23. Around 621 BC, King Josiah of Judah ordered a purification of the temple in Jerusalem that included the destruction of altars, the burning of sacred objects, and the execution of priests who did not conform to the new religious guidelines. But here's what the texts don't explicitly say. This reform coincided with political pressure from the Assyrian Empire for vassal states to conform their religious practices to imperial standards. Josiah wasn't purifying religion. He was collaborating with foreign occupiers to domesticate a spiritual tradition that threatened imperial stability. Assyrian documents discovered in Nineveh confirmed that the empire had specific policies to correct local religious traditions that promoted sedition or resistance to established authority, and cults that worshipped deities associated with the liberation of slaves or challenging social hierarchies were specifically targeted for reform. The discovery of the Book of the Law during this reform, described as a chance find in the temple, actually represents one of the earliest documented examples of systematic textual revision. Modern textual analyses show that Deuteronomy, the supposedly discovered book, contains layers of editing that clearly reflect the political agendas of the Assyrian period. Specifically, Deuteronomy emphasizes obedience to authority, discourages political resistance, and promotes a centralized version of religion that can be more easily controlled by the state. This is the exact opposite of Yahweh's original tradition, which promoted decentralization, resistance to oppression, and protection for the marginalized. But the suppression became even more systematic during the Babylonian period. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, it was not merely a military conquest. It was a cultural operation aimed at eliminating traditions that fueled political resistance. And the primary targets were texts, objects, and traditions associated with the original worship of Yahweh. Babylonian documents found in Nippur archives show specific guidelines for dealing with seditious cults among deported populations. Babylonian scribes received explicit orders to correct religious texts that could incite rebellion or promote discontent with imperial authority. And here's a discovery that will shock you. We have documentary evidence of entire libraries being destroyed specifically because they contained incorrect versions of sacred texts. A letter from the Neo-Babylonian period, discovered in Babylon in 1983, recounts the burning of Jewish texts that promote improper worship of the god Yahweh. The letter specifies that scrolls depicting Yahweh as a god of war against empires, and texts locating this god in the lands of the Cushites were destroyed. This is not a modern interpretation. It is contemporary documentation of the intentional destruction of evidence about Yahweh's African origin and revolutionary character. But the censorship operation became even more sophisticated during the Persian period. When Cyrus allowed the exiles to return to Jerusalem, it wasn't out of generosity, it was strategy. The Persians discovered that it was more effective to control populations through their own collaborative religious leadership than through direct oppression. The result was the emergence of a new priestly class that owed its position not to authentic religious tradition, but to imperial approval. And this new leadership had a direct interest in suppressing aspects of the Yahwist tradition that could cause political problems with the Persian occupiers. Documents found in Persepolis show correspondence between Persian authorities and Jewish leaders discussing the need to moderate problematic aspects of Jewish religious tradition. One specific letter, dated 515 BC, mentions the importance of avoiding geographical references that could stimulate nationalism and narratives that glorify resistance to imperial authority. And here's where it gets sinister. This collaboration wasn't presented as political betrayal, but as theological maturity. Leaders who suppressed revolutionary aspects of the Yahwist tradition were praised for promoting universalism and higher spirituality. Censorship was disguised as spiritual evolution. The operation became even more systematic during the Hellenistic period. When Alexander conquered the Middle East, he brought not only armies, but a cultural agenda aimed at civilizing local traditions that did not conform to Greek standards. And traditions that associated deities with African characteristics were specifically targeted for correction. We have documents from the Library of Alexandria that show specific projects to improve Eastern religious texts, removing elements that might be offensive to Greek sensibilities. Alexandrian scholars received imperial funding to produce corrected versions of sacred texts that removed barbarisms and ethnic particularisms. And the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was part of that operation. It wasn't just a translation, but a cultural revision intended to make Jewish tradition palatable to the Greeks. And part of that palatability involved removing specific references to Yahweh's African origins and his revolutionary political agenda. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this censorship is how it perpetuates itself. During the Roman period, active censorship was no longer necessary. Suppression had become so institutionalized that the religious schools themselves taught expurgated versions of the tradition as if they were originals. Entire generations of scribes, priests, and scholars were educated in a version of religious history that deliberately excluded information about the African origins and revolutionary character of Yahweh. They didn't know they were perpetuating censorship. They thought they were preserving authentic tradition. And this institutionalized ignorance continues to this day. Modern seminaries teach versions of biblical history that are based on texts that were edited more than 2,000 years ago to remove problematic information. Professors who never knew that censorship occurred unconsciously perpetuate the results of that censorship. The ultimate irony is that the suppression was so successful that today, people who question official versions of religious history are accused of inventing conspiracy theories, when in fact they are merely uncovering evidence of real conspiracies that were documented by their own perpetrators. The question remains, if they managed to censor God's identity for over 2,000 years, what other truths have they managed to censor? And what happens when we begin to systematically undo millennia of historical manipulation? Comment suppression if you are impressed by the evidence of systematic censorship and want to know how we can recover the truths that have been deliberately hidden. Now we come to the heart of the spiritual question. What does it mean theologically to discover that God's own name was censored because it was too revolutionary for empires to tolerate? And how does this revelation transform not only our understanding of history, but our personal relationship with the sacred and our understanding of what it truly means to worship? Let's begin with a fundamental reflection. In the biblical tradition, names are not merely labels. They are declarations of essence, character, and purpose. When God reveals himself to Moses as "I am who I am," Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, he is not simply providing identification. He is making a revolutionary philosophical and political statement about the nature of divine existence. Consider the context. Moses is standing before a deity that manifests as an unconsuming fire, speaking from a burning bush that does not burn itself. And when Moses asks its name, the answer is not a noun, but a verb. "I am who I am" is a declaration of pure self-determination, an existence independent of any external system of validation or control. In the ancient world, this was philosophically radical. All other gods had names that placed them within cosmic hierarchies, that defined them in relation to other powers, that limited them to specific functions within established pantheons. Yahweh presents himself as existing independently of any system, answering only to himself. But let's delve deeper into the political implications of this. In the imperial context of antiquity, all gods served the state. Marduk served Babylon, Assur served Assyria, Ptah served Egypt. These gods legitimized imperial authority, justified slavery, and blessed conquests. Their divinity was subordinate to political power. Yahweh presents himself as radically different. "I am who I am" means, I do not derive my authority from any political system. I do not exist to serve any empire. I cannot be domesticated by any human hierarchy. It is a declaration of divine independence that automatically implies the illegitimacy of any human authority that presents itself as absolute. And here's where it gets spiritually revolutionary. If you worship a God who exists independently of human power systems, that automatically transforms your relationship with those systems. You can no longer passively accept unjust hierarchies because your God doesn't. You can no longer submit to oppression as if it were divine will, because your God is defined precisely by the refusal to submit. But let's get to the racial dimension of this. When we discover that this revolutionary God had African features, it adds an extra layer of political and spiritual significance. We're not just talking about a God who defies empires, we're talking about a black God who defies white empires. In the context of antiquity, this meant that blackness itself became a theological statement. To be black like Yahweh was not a genetic accident or a social disadvantage. It was participation in the very appearance of the Creator. It was to physically carry the image of the divinity that defies oppression. And this completely transforms the spirituality of resistance. When you know you share physical characteristics with the God who freed slaves from Egypt, your fight against oppression is not just political, it's liturgical. Your resistance to injustice is not just social, it's worship. Let's consider the practical implications of this. Imagine prayers where, instead of appealing to a generic Lord who may or may not care about social justice, you specifically invoke Yahweh, the black God who has a documented history of liberating the oppressed and overthrowing tyrants. Imagine the psychological and spiritual difference between these two forms of prayer, and there's a mystical dimension to it that is profoundly transformative. In the Jewish and Christian mystical tradition, there is the concept of imitatio Dei, imitation of God. The idea is that spiritual growth involves becoming more like God in character and action. But if God is systematically presented as serving the status quo, then imitation of God becomes social conformity. You become more spiritual by being more submissive, more accepting of existing hierarchies, more passive in the face of injustice. Now imagine imitatio Dei based on the authentic Yahweh, the black God who defies empires. Spiritual growth becomes developing the courage to resist oppression. Holiness becomes a commitment to social justice. Religious maturity becomes a willingness to confront unjust systems. And this has implications for the very nature of contemplative prayer. In mystical traditions, the goal is often union with God, experiencing unity with the divine. But union with which version of the divine? Union with a domesticated God who blesses existing hierarchies, or union with Yahweh, the revolutionary God who exists independently of human systems of power? The difference is transformative. Mystical union with Yahweh does not produce political quietism. It produces spiritual activism. It does not result in escapism. It results in transformative engagement with the injustices of the world. And there's a prophetic dimension to this that is especially relevant. In the biblical tradition, prophets are people who speak on behalf of Yahweh to challenge social injustices. But if Yahweh has been domesticated and whitewashed, then prophecy becomes merely abstract moral criticism. Recovering the authentic Yahweh means recovering a prophetic tradition that is specifically political, specifically committed to the marginalized, specifically threatening to unjust systems. It means understanding that speaking in God's name is not about offering generic spiritual comfort, but about confronting specific powers that oppress specific people. But perhaps the deepest spiritual implication is for our understanding of creation itself. If humans are made in the image of God, and if God has African features, then blackness is not a deviation from the divine norm. It is an especially clear expression of that norm. This does not mean black racial supremacy. It means recognizing that human racial diversity reflects different aspects of infinite divine creativity. But it also means that characteristics that have been systematically marginalized and despised may be precisely those that most clearly reflect the appearance of the Creator. The final question is personal. How does this revelation change your own prayer, your own meditation, your own search for connection with the sacred? How does it transform your expectations of what God wants from you in terms of action in the world? Because ultimately, recovering the true name and identity of Yahweh is not just an academic exercise. It is the rediscovery of a spiritual force that was censored precisely because it was too transformative for the power systems to tolerate. Comment Yahweh lives if this theological perspective is transforming your understanding of what it truly means to worship and follow the biblical God. Stop for a moment and take a deep breath. We are reaching the crucial point of this journey, and I need to ask a direct question that will determine how you emerge from this experience. Are you willing to live with the implications of what we have discovered? Because knowing the truth about Yahweh is not just a matter of historical information. It is choosing a spiritual and political path that will put you in direct conflict with systems that depend on a domesticated version of God to maintain their power. Let's be brutally honest about what it means to follow authentic Yahweh in 2024. It means recognizing that your religion, if you have one, may be unconsciously serving the same kinds of empires that Yahweh has always challenged. It means questioning whether your spirituality is producing conformity or resistance, passivity or transformative courage. And that's uncomfortable. It's much easier to worship a generic Lord who blesses your life without requiring you to question the unjust systems around you. It's much more convenient to have a relationship with God that doesn't interfere with your social comfort, your economic advantages, your political privileges. But Yahweh, the black God who freed slaves and defied pharaohs, doesn't offer that kind of comfortable spirituality. Yahweh demands that you choose sides. He demands that you stand against oppression, even when that oppression benefits you. He demands that you use whatever privilege you have to amplify marginalized voices. And here's an even more uncomfortable reflection. If you are white and have absorbed these revelations about Yahweh, what does this mean for your identity? It means acknowledging that your spiritual tradition may have been built upon the suppression of truths about a black God. It means accepting that your religion may have been complicit in oppressions you never questioned. This can generate guilt, and guilt can be paralyzing. But Yahweh is not interested in guilt. He is interested in transformation. The question is not how you can feel bad about the past, but how you can act differently in the future. How can you use your discoveries to become a more effective ally in the fight for justice? And what if you are black and have absorbed these revelations? The challenge is different, but equally profound. It is about resisting the temptation to use this information to fuel racial supremacy, when in fact it should fuel spiritual dignity. It is about understanding that sharing characteristics with Yahweh does not make you superior to others, but gives you a special responsibility to lead struggles for liberation. Because here is an uncomfortable truth. Black oppressors who use their blackness to justify injustices are just as contrary to the spirit of Yahweh as white oppressors who use religion to justify racial supremacy. The point is not to replace one racial hierarchy with another. It is to end unjust hierarchies. But let's delve even deeper. What does it mean to discover that God's own name has been censored? What other truths about reality might have been systematically suppressed? If they managed to hide Yahweh's racial and political identity for over 2,000 years, what other historical manipulations were they able to achieve? This question can lead in two directions: paralyzing skepticism or discriminative wisdom. Paralyzing skepticism says, if everything can be a lie, nothing can be known. Discriminative wisdom says, if some things are lies, I need to develop better criteria to distinguish truth from manipulation. And the criteria are clear. Truths that have been systematically suppressed are generally truths that challenge unjust power. Information that has been censored is generally information that would empower people to resist oppression. History that has been rewritten has generally been rewritten to benefit oppressors at the expense of the oppressed. So here's the question that will define the rest of your spiritual life. Do you want a relationship with God that comforts your current position in the world, or a relationship with Yahweh that transforms your position in the world? Do you want a spirituality that confirms your existing certainties, or a spirituality that challenges you to grow in courage and compassion? Because these are mutually exclusive choices. You cannot simultaneously follow the Yahweh who liberates slaves and maintain lifestyles that depend on the exploitation of others. You cannot worship the God who challenges empires and remain passive in the face of the injustices of contemporary empires. And there's a deeper personal dimension to it. Discovering that God has been censored means discovering that you've been deceived about the fundamental nature of reality. This can produce anger, and anger can be constructive or destructive. Constructive anger becomes energy for change. Destructive anger becomes paralyzing bitterness. The choice between these two forms of anger will determine whether these revelations transform you into an agent of liberation or turn you into a bitter and cynical person. Yahweh wants you to use your anger to build justice, not to destroy relationships. But perhaps the most important reflection is on hope. Because discovering that Yahweh has always been an ally of the oppressed means discovering that resistance to injustice is not just a political strategy, it is an act of worship. It means that fighting for a better world is not just human idealism, it is cooperation with the divine purpose. And that changes everything, because when you know that God is on your side in the fight for justice, you can persevere even when the odds seem impossible. You can maintain hope even when unjust powers seem invincible. You can find courage even when the cost of resistance is high. The final question is, are you ready for this transformation? Are you willing to let the rediscovery of Yahweh change not only your thoughts, but your actions? Are you prepared to live as a person who knows that God himself was censored by the same kinds of powers that still oppress people today? Because this choice will determine whether you finish this video as the same person you started, or as someone who has been transformed by the courage to face dangerous truths. It will determine whether these revelations become merely interesting information or a transformative force in your life and the lives of those around you. Yahweh is waiting for your answer. Comment transformation if you're ready to let these revelations change your life, or reflection if you're still processing what all this means to you. Now that we've gone through this deep reflection, the most important moment has arrived. How will you live differently from today onward? How will you incorporate the rediscovery of Yahweh into your daily decisions, your relationships, and the way you use money, time, and influence? Because if these revelations don't change how you live, they were merely intellectual entertainment. Let's start with something immediate and practical. How will you pray differently now? If you have a life of prayer or meditation, imagine the difference between appealing to a generic Lord and specifically invoking Yahweh, the dark God who has a documented history of liberating the oppressed and overthrowing tyrants. This isn't just a change in vocabulary, it's a fundamental shift in expectations about what God wants to do in the world. When you pray for justice, you are no longer asking a God who may or may not care about social issues. You are appealing to Yahweh, who defines himself precisely by his commitment to the marginalized. When you pray for courage to do the right thing, you are no longer expecting God to bless you with spiritual passivity. You are asking the God who challenged pharaohs to give you the strength to challenge contemporary injustices. But let's get to more specific applications. How does this change your consumption decisions? If you truly believe that Yahweh is on the side of the oppressed, this should affect where you shop, which companies you support, and how you invest your money. Can you consciously continue supporting businesses that exploit workers, pollute the environment, or perpetuate social injustices? The obvious answer is no. Following Yahweh means using your economic power, however small, to support justice and resist exploitation. It means researching companies before buying their products. It means choosing investments that align with values of liberation, not just maximum financial return. And what about your personal relationships? How does the rediscovery of Yahweh change the way you interact with people of different races, social classes, and sexual orientations? If you have truly internalized that God has been systematically whitewashed and domesticated to serve unjust powers, this should make you much more sensitive to other forms of marginalization. This means honestly examining your unconscious biases. It means questioning why you might feel more comfortable in certain social situations than others. It means using your relationships to amplify voices that have been systematically silenced. But let's look at a more challenging application. How does this affect your career choices? If you work in systems that perpetuate injustice, whether in the financial sector that exploits the poor, in healthcare that prioritizes profit over healing, or in education that perpetuates inequalities, what does it mean to continue in those jobs after rediscovering Yahweh? I'm not saying you should immediately quit your job, but I am saying you should question how you can use your current position to promote justice instead of perpetuating oppression. How can you be an agent of change within the systems you're in, even if those systems have structural problems? And that may require courage to speak out when you see injustices, to question policies that harm vulnerable people, to use whatever influence you have to protect the marginalized. It may mean taking professional risks to do the right thing. Let's talk about education, your own and that of those around you. How will you continually educate yourself on issues of social justice, suppressed history, and marginalized spiritual traditions? Following Yahweh means a lifelong commitment to learning about how systems of oppression work and how they can be transformed. And how will you educate others? If you have children, how will you teach them about religious diversity, about history that isn't taught in schools, about the importance of questioning dominant narratives? If you have influence in religious communities, how will you promote honest discussions about the African origins of Christianity? But here's an application that can be especially challenging. How does this change your relationship with religious authority? If leaders in your church, denomination, or spiritual tradition promote domesticated versions of God that serve the status quo, how will you respond? This may require the courage to question teachings that promote passivity in the face of injustice. It may mean seeking out spiritual communities that integrate authentic faith with social action. It may involve leaving behind religious traditions that resist honest conversations about race, power, and justice. And it has an important political application. How does this revelation change your electoral choices and your civic activism? If you now understand that Yahweh has always been on the side of the marginalized against the powerful, this should profoundly affect how you evaluate candidates and policies. This means supporting policies that protect the vulnerable, even when those policies might cost you something personally. It means voting based on how policy decisions affect the most marginalized, not just how they affect your own economic situation. But let's look at an even more practical application. How can we use this information to build bridges between communities? Knowledge about Yahweh's African origins can be a powerful tool for racial healing, but only if used with wisdom and sensitivity. This means sharing these findings in ways that educate rather than alienate, that build understanding rather than create defensiveness. It means recognizing that for many people, questioning traditional representations of God can be deeply threatening. So these conversations need to be marked by patience and compassion. And it has a creative application. How can you use art, music, writing, or other forms of expression to promote a more inclusive understanding of the divine? How can you contribute to an artistic renaissance that celebrates the true historical diversity of Christianity? But perhaps the most important application is daily spiritual discipline. How will you maintain a regular connection with Yahweh, not the domesticated Lord, but the revolutionary God who exists independently of human systems of power? This may involve developing new forms of prayer that explicitly invoke Yahweh's commitment to justice. It may mean studying biblical texts that have been marginalized because they promote liberation. It may include meditation practices that connect spiritual growth with social action. The final question is about persistence. How will you maintain these commitments when faced with resistance? When the cost of following Yahweh becomes personal? When you are tempted to return to a spirituality that is more comfortable but less transformative? Because following Yahweh is not a spiritual hobby that you can practice when convenient. It is a lifelong commitment to living in a way that honors the God who was censured precisely because he challenged injustices. Comment on a specific and concrete application that you will implement in your life this week. Be specific, be bold, be committed. Now let's broaden our perspective and discover something fascinating. Around the world, communities marginalized by great empires have independently preserved traditions that have kept alive the memory of a revolutionary Yahweh. And these traditions can teach us how to recover the transformative power that has been systematically suppressed in mainstream versions of Christianity. We begin with Ethiopia, which we mentioned earlier, but which deserves deeper analysis. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its origins back to the 4th century, preserved not only visual representations of a black Christ, but also literal traditions that were never altered by European powers. In its sacred texts, Yahweh is consistently referred to with titles that geographically locate him in the south, in the Kushite regions. Even more fascinating, Ethiopian liturgy preserves prayers that invoke Yahweh as God of our Kushite fathers, as the one who came from the southern mountains, as liberator of the dark peoples. These are not modern additions. They are traditions that have been continuously preserved for over 1,600 years, independent of European influence. And there's something even more impressive. Ethiopian manuscripts contain versions of biblical texts that are older than many manuscripts considered authoritative by Western scholarship. The famous Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, Glory of the Kings, contains narratives about the origins of Yahweh that were never included in the biblical canons established by the European councils. But let's go beyond Ethiopia. In India, communities of St. Thomas Christians, who trace their origins to the Apostle Thomas in the 1st century, independently developed an understanding of Jesus that is very different from European interpretations. In their ancient prayers, preserved in Syriac, Jesus is consistently associated with wisdom traditions that emphasize liberation of the oppressed. And here is something remarkable. These Indian communities never developed an association between whiteness and divinity. In their traditional art, Jesus and biblical figures are depicted with Indian features, and this is seen not as cultural adaptation, but as a natural expression of the universal nature of the divine incarnation. In Mexico and Central America, indigenous communities forced to convert to Christianity developed forms of syncretism that preserved elements of their ancestral spiritual wisdom while incorporating Christian elements. And fascinatingly, in many of these traditions, Jesus is understood as an ally of the oppressed against imperial powers. The famous tradition of the Virgin of Guadalupe is a perfect example of this. When analyzing the original story, we discover that the Virgin appears specifically to an indigenous man, Juan Diego, during a period of brutal Spanish oppression. And the image itself contains symbols that any specialist in pre-Columbian iconography recognizes as being specifically designed to speak to indigenous sensibilities. Most importantly, the Virgin's message is one of liberation, of dignity for the marginalized, of challenge for those in power. This wasn't a cultural accident. It was the preservation of the revolutionary spirit of Yahweh in a context of colonial oppression. And let's move on to contemporary Africa, where some of the fastest growing Christian movements are developing understandings of Jesus that are strikingly similar to the ancient traditions we have discovered. South African theologians like Desmond Tutu and Alan Bosak developed black theology that explicitly connects Christian faith with liberation movements. Mas-Elis weren't inventing new theology. Eels were rediscovering ancient truths que had been systematically suppressed. Cuando African Christians comenzaron reading biblical texts without European interpretive filters, they naturally discovered Jesus que looks like them y shares their experience de oppression. Y tem uma dimension global ainda more fascinating. Indigenous communities around O world, when encountering Christianity, often naturally interpret Jesus a través lenses que emphasize his solidarity com marginalized peoples. Native American communities, Aboriginal Australians, Pacific Islanders, all desenvolveram independently understandings de Jesus, que prioritize justice sobre conformity, liberation sobre submission. Isso suggests que when people encounter biblical narratives without heavy European interpretive overlay, they naturally discover revolutionary rather than conservative messages. They naturally see Jesus como ally dos oppressed rather than defender do status quo. Na Ásia, communities in Philippines, Indonesia, and otras regions onde Christianity was introduced through colonial contexts, often developed underground traditions that maintained subversive interpretations to Christian texts. During periods of Japanese or European occupation, essas communities found strength in understanding Jesus como one que também suffered under imperial oppression. E aqui está something truly remarkable. Quando scholars começam comparing essas various global traditions que developed independently, they find striking similarities in how marginalized communities understand divine nature. Almost universally, they develop interpretations que emphasize God's commitment para justice, liberation, and solidarity come suffering peoples. Isso can't be coincidence. Isso suggests que when people encounter biblical narratives through their own experience to marginalization, rather than through lenses to dominant powers, they naturally discover truths that were systematically suppressed in mainstream traditions. But perhaps most fascinating is what is happening today. Through global communication, these various traditions are beginning to dialogue with each other. African theologians are learning from Latin American liberation theology. Indigenous Christians are sharing insights with Asian liberation movements. Marginalized communities globally are discovering that they have preserved pieces of a larger truth that was broken apart by centuries of imperial suppression. And technology is playing a crucial role in this. Social media, online communities, and digital libraries are making accessible texts and traditions that were previously known only to small, isolated communities. For the first time in centuries, global conversation is becoming possible about what authentic, non-colonized Christianity might look like. But resistance is fierce. Because esse global rediscovery de revolutionary Christianity represents existential threat para religious establishments que built their power and domesticated versions de faith. Institutions que benefit from passive, conformist Christianity are fighting hard para maintain their interpretive authority. But momentum is building. Younger generations globally are increasingly attracted to forms of spirituality that integrate personal transformation with social justice, offering hope for systemic change rather than just individual salvation. This represents an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time since ancient times, conditions exist for a global renaissance of revolutionary spirituality that could challenge the imperial powers of our own era, just as Yahweh challenged the empires of antiquity. Question A. Will established religious institutions adapt para essa renaissance? Ou will they continue fighting para preserve domesticated versions de faith que serve existing power structures? Comment global if you are inspired by the diversity of expressions around the world and want to connect with these global movements for spiritual and social liberation. We've reached the end of this revolutionary journey, and now it's time to talk about what really matters. How this rediscovery of Yahweh can catalyze a transformation that goes far beyond individual spiritual growth to become a force that literally changes civilizations. Because what we've discovered today isn't just historical correction. It's an opportunity for collective healing that humanity has been waiting for centuries. Let's start with a vision. Imagine a world where children of all races grow up seeing God represented in all his human diversity. Imagine what that would do for global self-esteem, for racial reconciliation, for building a society that truly celebrates all human diversity as a reflection of divine creativity. Studies in developmental psychology show that children who grow up with diverse, positive representations of authority figures, including spiritual figures, develop greater self-confidence, greater interracial empathy, and a lower propensity for prejudice. Now imagine this applied on a global scale, with billions of children growing up with a more inclusive understanding of the divine. Let's go beyond children. Think about impact que essa revelation pode have in healing historical traumas. Communities que foram systematically marginalized para centuries, que internalized feelings de spiritual inferiority, que were taught que their appearance was inconsistent come holiness. Imagine transformative power, the discovering que they literally share appearance come creator. This isn't just symbolism. Racial trauma is real trauma, with measurable psychological effects that are transmitted through generations. And spiritual healing is real healing, with documented power to transform not only individuals, but entire communities. And consider the impact this could have on religion itself, a Christianity that embraces its African origins, that celebrates its historical diversity, that recognizes its true universality. That is a Christianity that is more attractive to an increasingly diverse world. It is a Christianity that can genuinely speak to all cultures without colonizing them. The practical implications are enormous. Churches that embrace this diversity will attract more diverse congregations. Seminary programs that teach this more complete history will form more conscious leaders. Religious organizations that incorporate these perspectives will be more effective in serving marginalized communities. But impact goes far beyond religion. Let's talk about art and culture. Imagine an artistic renaissance where artists of all races feel free to create authentic representations of the divine. Imagine museums that celebrate the real historical diversity of religious art. Imagine an entertainment industry that produces films and books where biblical figures are portrayed with historical accuracy rather than European stereotypes. This would create not only greater cultural accuracy, but also greater aesthetic richness. European Renaissance art is beautiful, but imagine the beauty that could emerge when African, Asian, indigenous, and mixed-race artists feel equally authorized to interpret sacred themes through their own cultural lenses. Consider educational impact. Educational systems could teach more complete and accurate history do Christianity vão produce more conscious citizens, more critical thinkers, more pessoas capable de questioning dominant narratives. They'll form pessoas que know how para distinguish between authentic faith and political manipulation. This has implications for democracy. Citizens who have learned to question a dominant religious narrative are more capable of questioning other political and social narratives that may be serving hidden agendas. A more conscious population is a more democratic population, but perhaps the most important impact would be on social justice. Because recognizing a Black Jesus isn't just theological correction, it's an act of restorative justice for billions of people who have been spiritually disenfranchised. It's returning dignity that was stolen, restoring identity that was suppressed, healing wounds that have festered for centuries. Essa individual healing becomes social transformation. Pessoas que feel genuinely valued per God become more confident in demanding fair treatment in society. Communities who recognize their divine dignity become more capable de resisting oppression and fighting para their rights. Let's be specific about how you can be part of this transformation. First, commit to ongoing education. This video is just the beginning. Seek books, articles, and documentaries that explore these questions in greater depth. Become a genuinely informed person about these issues. Second, use sua influence, whatever size it is, para spread accurate information. Share esse knowledge com friends, family, colleagues. Post about it responsibly in social media. Incorporate it into conversations onde appropriate. Become educator in seu próprio circles. Third, support organizations and individuals who are doing essa work. There's some scholars, artists, activists, and spiritual leaders who have been researching and promoting essas perspectives para years. Find them, support them, amplify their voices. Fourth, examine and transform your own biases. Use this knowledge as a starting point for deeper self-reflection about race, privilege, and spiritual assumptions. Allow this revelation to change not only your mind, but your heart. Fifth, if you're in a position of influence, as a parent, teacher, pastor, artist, or business leader, use that position to promote more inclusive and accurate representations. Create change in systems you have access to. Sixth, develop sustainable practices to maintain these commitments. Create daily spiritual disciplines that keep you connected to the revolutionary spirit of Yahweh. Join or form communities that support this journey. Make this a lifelong commitment, not temporary enthusiasm. But remember, transformation takes time. Social change is measured in decades, not days. Spiritual healing happens across generations, not just in individuals. Be patient with the process while remaining committed to the goal. Be prepared para resistance. Pessoas que built their identity around exclusive religious narratives will fight para preserve those narratives. Institutions que benefited from racial hierarchies will resist challenges para those hierarchies. Your commitment para truth and justice needs para be stronger due to their commitment para comfortable lies. But also remember that you're not alone. Around the world, millions of people are awakening to these same truths. You're part of a global movement toward greater spiritual authenticity, greater historical accuracy, and greater social justice. Your individual transformation is part of a collective transformation that can heal some of humanity's deepest wounds. Ultimate question isn't whether essa transformation will happen. It's already happening. Question A, whether you'll be part deity. Whether you'll use sua life para advance truth and justice, or whether you'll remain passive while others do hard work to change. The choice is yours. And that choice will determine not only your own spiritual journey, but your contribution to the healing of the world. Future depends on people like você tendo courage para embrace uncomfortable truths, wisdom para apply them lovingly, a persistence para maintain commitments even when cost becomes personal. Yahweh, the revolutionary God who defied empires and was censored precisely because he was so threatening to unjust powers, is waiting to see what you'll do with this revelation. The world is waiting to see whether you'll allow this knowledge to transform, not just how you think, but how you live. Time to choose. Time to act. Time to become a person who honors the truth that was suppressed, because it was too dangerous for systems of oppression to tolerate. Welcome para movement. Welcome para truth. Welcome para a more authentic, liberating understanding the divine. Now go change the world. Comment, committed to transformation. If you're ready to dedicate part of your life to promoting these truths in a loving, persistent, and transformative way. We've reached the end of this absolutely revolutionary journey, but in truth, this is only the beginning. If you've watched this far, you've demonstrated the courage to question fundamental assumptions, the wisdom to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable, and the openness to allow that truth to transform you. But watching isn't enough. Knowledge without action is just entertainment. The question now is, what will you do with what you've learned? First, if this content opened your eyes, if it challenged your assumptions, if it gave you hope or inspired you to think differently, hit that like button. Not for the algorithm, but as a declaration that you value truth over comfort, growth over stagnation, justice over convenient lies. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this conversation is far from over. There are more hidden truths to uncover, more historical narratives to examine, more opportunities for transformation ahead, and you don't want to miss any of it. But most importantly, leave a comment telling me how this information is going to change how you live. Are you going to educate your children differently? Are you going to question other historical narratives? Are you going to become an advocate for more inclusive representation? Are you going to deepen your own spiritual journey? Be specific, be honest, be bold, because your commitment in the comments isn't just for me, it's for you. It's your public declaration of what kind of person you choose to become after this revelation. And if you know someone, a friend, family member, colleague, or spiritual leader who needs to hear this information, share this video with them, not to create conflict, but to create awareness, not to destroy faith, but to purify it, not to divide, but to unite humanity under a more authentic understanding of our shared divine image. Remember, every great transformation in history started como individuals que had courage para speak uncomfortable truths como love. Você have opportunity para be one of those individuals, para be part the generation que heals ancient wounds and builds more just a spiritually authentic world. Truth você discovered today isn't meant para stay hidden. It's meant para spread, para grow, para transform communities and cultures, and maybe even civilization itself. Mas isso only happens si people like você have courage para share it, para live it, para embody it. So I ask you one final time, will you be part of this transformation? Will you allow what you've learned to change not just how you think, but how you live? Will you help others discover these same liberating truths? The answers you give to those questions will determine not just your own spiritual journey, but your contribution to the healing of our world. Based on your courage to watch this entire video, based on your openness to question everything you thought you knew, I believe your answer will be yes. Welcome para transformation. Welcome para truth. Welcome para more authentic and liberating understanding do divine.